the hierarchy in Atlantis, they were people who were looking for a cure for a virus that had affected their society. And they had watched us for a very long time before they made themselves known to the Lemurians. They understood that we had a type of immunity that affected us on the island. And from then on, it was about our working with them to understand how we could help them, how our two nations could work together. And we sat down one night with the others and we decided to get out the red crystals and to hold a session with them, one of our meditation sessions where we tapped in to whatever it was that we needed guidance on. And the guidance we received was a message from the commander saying, this is your unity is based on these people are from the crew member who went to Atlantis, and your people are from the woman Evie who came from this original indigenous community with the commander. You are deeply tied together. Please try to make it work, but at the same time, do not give the Atlanteans any of the crystals. No matter what you do, just don't give them any of them. It's not meant for them, because once they have the crystals, they will use them to hurt people. They will use them against people. And that's exactly what ended up happening.
Right. So the Atlanteans have these flying technologies and they are high tech, and they have some kind of virus that's rampant, that's going through their society, creating havoc. And yet Lemuria is low tech and it's perfect health for everyone. So, the obvious question would be, well, didn't the Atlanteans just work out that their society was dysfunctional, and that somehow that was why that they were suffering this kind of virus, that they just hadn't reached some kind of moral or ethical balance with nature? I guess they just weren't aware of that. They were oblivious to that. And Lemuria was the opposite. You were in balance with nature and had perfect health.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Jen Sullivan to the show, to Exopolitics Today. Now, she sent me a copy of her recent book, A Child of the Universe. I have a copy here. And when I read this book, I was truly fascinated because it talks about the history of Lemuria from the perspective of someone that lived during those times and someone who occupied a very senior position within the hierarchy of Lemurian civilization. An incredible story. And Jen Sullivan is here. Now, Jen joins me from the big island of Hawaii, where she lives with her husband and 3 kids, and she's just started up a publishing company. So welcome to the show, Jen.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So why don't you tell us, how did you get to write this book? And I know you got to work with Sarah Breskman-Cosmes. So why don't you explain to my audience how you got to know Sarah and how it was that she began to do these quantum hypnosis healing technique sessions with you?
Definitely. It's actually a pretty interesting story. It's something that I look back and I think, wow, there are definitely other forces at work and pushing you towards certain things in your life. But I first met Sarah about 10, maybe 12 years ago when our older children were small and they were in pre-K together when we lived in the Florida Keys. And we got to know each other just on the playground and while our kids went to school and birthday parties. But I never really knew that she was a hypnotist or any kind of stuff like that. She kept that to herself. So most of our conversations over the years were just, you go into that soccer game or you go to that birthday party. And we kind of left it there until 2017. When Hurricane Irma came through the Florida Keys as a Category 5 storm. And it just devastated our island. It literally put thousands and thousands of people homeless, us included, Sarah as well for a while. All our homes were destroyed, our businesses, our cars, everything was gone. And through that, I found out a couple of months after the hurricane, as we were cleaning up all the toxic debris left behind after a hurricane, that I had developed a type of issue with my brain. that there was an excess amount of cerebrospinal fluid that was forming like water tumors in my brain. The condition's called pseudotumor cerebri. And this was something that took me by surprise. I was normally quite healthy. I didn't have a lot of issues like that, but I found out because I woke up one morning and I couldn't see out of this eye. Just one morning I woke up and it was gone. So I went to all the doctors that I could down in the Florida Keys. I went to all the specialists up at the University of Miami. They had a very bleak prognosis for me, saying that there was really nothing they can do other than put me on a lot of heavy medication. I had a lot of adverse reactions to the medication. So I needed to find something else that was going to help me, because I had little children and we were living in kind of squalor at the time because we really didn't get a lot of help after the hurricane destroyed our community. It took a long time for everyone to rebuild. So I was kind of stuck for a little bit. And one day Sarah called me up and asked me if I would be interested in doing a project with her, that she was doing a new type of hypnosis and she was going to need a subject to do some hypnosis on, just, you know, to record and to present to her group that she goes to. She is one of Dolores Cannon's, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dolores Cannon's form of hypnotherapy, but she's one of her students. And she was going for her next level 3, which would be like the highest level. So I didn't know what it was. I really wasn't familiar, but she told me that it could help cure any kind of illnesses that I may have. And she didn't know I was sick at the time too. So I said, well, that's perfect, because right now I'm just looking for anything that could help me with this illness that I've suddenly, you know, come down with. And I began doing hypnotherapy with Sarah Breskman Cosme that way. And through those, we had so many sessions, probably 2.5 years worth of sessions. We uncovered so many of my past lives, but the most remarkable one that we found was the one that was primarily in Lemúria as a child, and then I was taken to Atlantis as an adult in it.
Well, I think the fact that you actually were suffering from a tumor had impacted, impaired an impaired eye, and that the quantum healing hypnosis technique actually cured you, you know, not only shows the effectiveness of that, but also shows that the information you were bringing up in these hypnosis sessions, the fact that you brought them up and started to remember what occurred, that actually was an important part of the healing. And that's really, I think, significant in terms of, you know, people are always looking for evidence. Well, you know, what evidence is there that this is real? That is evidence right there.
Definitely. No, every session that I did, I would go and I would feel this while I was in the hypnotic state. I would feel almost like a draining sensation coming out from behind my eye, where the pressure would go down. And when I would kind of come out of my hypnotic state at the end, my vision was perfectly clear again and I could see out of my eye. And it took a while for me to realize that I was, in a very large sense, you know, you create your illnesses. And sometimes you create them in a way where your subconscious is trying to let out messages. Maybe they're from this life, maybe they're from other lifetimes. I think we're just big data banks full of memories from all kinds of existences. But sometimes things need to come out. And if you're not willing to accept it or let it out in one way, your body will force it out in another. And I think that was a large part of the illness that I you know, incurred upon myself there.
Well, with that illness, I mean, that actually connects to a prior life where you were, I believe, in New York, and you began to talk about your memories of Lemúria, and people didn't believe you, and that you were committed to a mental asylum at Bellevue, and that involves some stuff happening to your brain. So why don't you explain what happened to that and its connection to the illness that you experienced in this life?
Definitely. Well, one of the first past lives that came to me when I was beginning my sessions with Sarah was what I believe was the most recent past life I had before this existence, where I lived as a young woman named Christy in New York City. And Christy also, through chance, was able to understand this ancient past life she had in Lemúria and Atlantis. But because of the timing, it just was seen as a sign of psychosis with her trying to explain to people what had happened. And she was brought in to a mental institution to be evaluated, because that's kind of what people did to women in the 70s when they started talking a little bit differently than most of what society wanted them to say. And I'm actually writing, my second book is all about that lifetime too. I go a bit further into detail with it, and I've been doing more sessions to understand what it was and what that message is, but they're very linked to your current life as well. There's always an understanding of, why is this here? Why am I knowing it? But it's always to help you with something now and what is around you in your lifetime, to in an effect, not to repeat the mistakes you've made before. So that was that last lifetime as Christy. And she lived in New York City. She had all of this kind of, she had no support system as well. And that was another reason that she wasn't able to get this information about Lemuria and Atlantis out. And I think you kind of fine tune things when you go into your next existence. You know what works and what doesn't work. And I think maybe I made some different changes this time. It seems to be working a little bit better.
Well, I know just from my own research that the 1970s and 80s, and even earlier than that, these were very difficult periods for people to come forward and talk about these paranormal experiences, whether it was a contact experience with extraterrestrials or remembering past lives, that, yeah, you were ridiculed. And actually, there was one contactee that whose case I studied. He was a professor at the University of Mexico, and he was an actual nuclear medical professor. So he taught nuclear medicine at the University of Mexico, and he had a contact experience with Andromedan extraterrestrials, and he began to talk about it. And because it was just so way out there, his wife and family arranged for him to be committed to a mental asylum. So they took him into a mental asylum for a month. And after that, he was released and then disappeared. So I think the extraterrestrials just took him because it was such a hostile period of time to be talking about these things. And obviously, in your case, I mean, in that life as Christine, you chose to like jump off a bridge and bring an end to that life, and then reincarnate again immediately as Jen.
Yes, definitely. That was how that lifetime ended. Unfortunately, the circumstances in the mental institution were beyond my control. And it was a lifetime that I saw before me as just being stuck inside of a body, that I couldn't get this message out. And whether you think it's the right or wrong thing to do when you're in that position, it's the past. And I think in this lifetime, I've gone into this lifetime with a very different understanding of how valuable my life can be and what I need to create with it.
I guess that is a kind of testament to the importance of this life, or to the importance of getting this information out, that after that life ended, that you chose to reincarnate so quickly in this physical body, and to eventually remember that the information is so critical to this time. And maybe we will come back to that, but I thought that was very interesting as well, that, you know, you didn't choose that lifetime ended to kind of like stay in an after situation for a long time. It was like you were out and then pop back again in a new body as Jen.
Exactly. The information that we began to understand that was coming forth from the ancient lifetimes that I had in Lemuria and Atlantis, Sarah and I found was really important when you looked at the current circumstances that were going on, especially in 2020, when we both started writing the books and published them. You know, we had the pandemic breakout, we had political strife, turmoil. Look at where we're at right now. I find that so much of what we wrote about in both of our books can be paralleled by what you see going on in today's society. And if nothing, is it not more of a warning to tell us we're going down the wrong track, that we're going to self-combust, that we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves continuing on this matter? And perhaps we need to stop looking at the conditioning society has put around us, but to maybe take a deeper look inside of us and see what we're missing. and maybe understand why we're creating this chaos around us. And that's kind of what I took from it, that there are parallels that come out for a reason. And if anything, maybe we need to just take a better look at where we're at right now, as hard as it is to look at it.
So the information that you got through these quantum hypnosis sessions really is amazing. And so well, let's go back to the very beginning, that in terms of your incarnations on Earth, that one of your first life on Earth that you remembered was actually as an extraterrestrial that crash landed. So why don't you just explain what happened?
That was a surprising one for me. To be honest, going into a lot of Sarah's sessions, I was very skeptical about hypnosis, about ETs. All of this was not something I was very well versed in, or very, I don't know, it wasn't my kind of thing. And it surprised me when I came out of that session with her and I realized that I was an ET in a past life, and not, you know, the kind of green slimy one you picture coming out of some horror film, but, you know, like an educated, well, you know, thought out kind of person, not a human being, but a being that came here on a mission. And their mission was to kind of save their race from this dying planet that we had originally inhabited. And it was a colonization effort that I began to understand was taking place during this lifetime, that we came here on a mission, that I had a crew, and our goal was to kind of heighten the DNA of what we had already placed there many generations ago, that we had already kind of seed sprinkled the DNA and left it to evolve over time. And now we were going back on our first big mission to start just changing their DNA, making them think differently, act differently, kind of like an upgrade in many ways. And to create new children, to create these hybrid children. And I think that was the most important part of our mission, was to intermingle between our two groupings so that we could have this sustained survival over time.
And I know in your book, you described how it wasn't just your ship that crash landed, that there were other ships with similar missions from the same world that also crash landed. And I was a little, you know, maybe you can explain, well, why did the ships crash land? Why didn't they just land so that the ships could then be used? Was there something about their design that, you know, after this long distance, they could only really crash land as opposed to land and be reusable?
That was something we looked at in our sessions too, because we thought, well, if such advanced technology, why are you crash landing at this point? And what we understood from the session was that the variance was needed, that they higher beings within that home planet planned for certain crafts to land successfully, certain crafts to not land successfully, and to kind of see what would happen over the course of time as we allowed this genetic variation to happen, this diversity, in order to create optimal conditions. So sometimes optimal conditions aren't created in a environment where you have everything you need. Sometimes you end up just sustaining yourself, or you end up just kind of stagnating when you have full success in some area. Sometimes you need to have something go wrong in order to have everything go right. And that was part of the plan. And there was not just one ship, there were so many of them. There were so many missions over time as well that would happen. So I think that also gives us a good idea of why there's so many different kinds of human beings on this planet, why we have such diversity, why we have such different histories, and why so many of our ancient philosophies and teachings all kind of link in together at the end of the day, though.
Now, I don't know if you actually mentioned the name of the world where those extraterrestrials came from, but we certainly know that over a period of maybe hundreds of years or generations, that there had been a number of kind of contact events that had happened, and at each time the genetics of the humans were upgraded in some way. So you were part of that you were part of this kind of genetic experimentation, and when your ship crash landed, a number of you survived that, and then you interacted with a local community in that area. So why don't you just explain how that happened, how you got to interact with the indigenous people of that time, and how the genetic experiments began with you and your the others that survived.
Yes, definitely. Well, in that lifetime, I took the form of a male being, and I call that lifetime the commander, because the person was in charge of, the being was in charge of the ship. It was their mission. And we had a very interesting crash landing into water, very freezing cold water. And it's something I wrote about in the book. It's something it was really cold. So it kind of lingers through the lifetimes. It was a shock at first to have the crash landing, but my crew was mostly okay. Several of them did not make it through, but the ones that did, we ended up trudging through the woods for a while until we came across a group of indigenous human beings or seedlings, whatever you'd like to call them, that were left from other experiments that had gone by. And we came to learn from them. We exchanged knowledge. We began to work with them in order to use our technology that we were able to salvage to enhance their lives. We tried to create hybrid children with them, and it was very unsuccessful. We lost several crew members through the years as we tried to work on this hybridization project. Some were killed between fights between each other. Others were killed by trying to take on the hybridization program themselves and give birth to a hybrid child. And it was a very sad situation to watch the crew kind of go one by one over the years as we worked so hard with these indigenous people. But we had one crew member who kind of went rogue and decided he was going to leave, and he was going to take what technology he had, and he was going to take the most important thing we had also, and it was something called a red crystal. And in our sessions, these crystals kept coming across, and I wasn't sure what they were, but it was something that had been mined before we came on this mission from another planet. And it was a source of energy that we could use to power pretty much anything that we needed within our technology. It also opened up these vortexes that allowed us to travel from one place to another. So from one colony to the next. If we needed to leave, we could get out. We could do that. If there was a natural disaster or just the locals were done with us kind of deal, we could skedaddle. But he tried to take all of the crystals through the vortex and leave us with nothing. And the one indigenous woman who was actually pregnant with a hybrid child at the time fought him and got sucked into this vortex with him and ended up in Lemúria. And he ended up in Atlantis. And that's kind of the beginning of those two civilizations of what we remember and what we know throughout, I think, the history we've painted in our books, and also the history you kind of see here and there is just the beginnings of these two civilizations happening from kind of the same single event, but being spread off onto the opposite ends of the globe to continue to grow. And whew, sorry, I'll give you a second to talk if you need to.
Sure. With these red crystals, I mean, they are an important part of the book because they do assert a power, and they could be used obviously for good purposes or negative purposes, and in your book cases. So yeah, can you describe more about how they looked? I mean, are we talking about something like a clear quartz crystal that's just red, or anything you can describe it?
Sure. The first image that I ever received of the red crystals, it's like burnt into my mind. It was a circular looking crystal, and it was just something that had been placed in my hand in one of the first sessions. And it was multifaceted, but a deep, deep, deep red, almost like a garnet, but it was deep, like very, like something that would just pull you into its depths. It wasn't a shiny type of crystal. It wasn't this bright quartzy thing that like was illuminated. It just had this depth to it that pulled you in. And I remember the multifaceted part, understanding that it did have some importance and how to use it, but I don't truly understand the purpose of all of that. I just know that's what I saw.
So you mentioned that this indigenous person that was carrying a hybrid child was sucked through the vortex and ended up in Lemúria, and she gave birth, and that child became the first queen of Lemúria, and her name was Una, spelled O-O-N-A, which I thought was really interesting because that is also the same name used by someone who's actually in contact with extraterrestrials. So yeah, can you speak a little bit more about Una and her role in starting up the Lemurian civilization as the first queen.
Yes, definitely. I understood that this woman, Evie, was the name of the indigenous woman who was sucked through the vortex and was transported to another colonization that was the beginning of Lemuria. And in her journey, she had also had several miscarriages previously with the experimentation. She had been very unsuccessful in wanting to have a child, and it was kind of a bad situation for her until this one happened, and she was sucked through the vortex to a place where they had the right technology to almost perform like a C-section on her, to remove the child without it being damaged and without her having to lose her life. So it was helpful, but her daughter Una grows to become this very special type of hybrid child that has this amazing, she embodies the powers of the old world, the home planet that we originally derived from, or many of us derived from, and begins the ancient reign of these queens of Lemuria. And throughout time and throughout history, over the course of thousands and thousands of years, her family still runs the country, and it gets to the point where it becomes a matriarchal society, where it is just a process of the women having a daughter through in vitro fertilization or ancient forms of in vitro fertilization, and then having more daughters and them running the country in that sense of their spiritual guidance and political guidance for the people.
So this brings us to that life that you had where you were a princess and you were in line to be the queen, and then these events happen. So why don't you kind of like summarize the events that why don't you first explain what kind of life you had in Lemuria that you recall as the princess?
Definitely. You know, it's funny, a lot of people say to me, well, how come you get lifetimes as princesses? I look back and all I get are lifetimes as chambermaids. And I said, you know, you got to look beyond the princess here, because it's only a title. When you look at what people really go through in their past lives, titles don't really matter much. It's the things that truly happen to them and what goes on. So in this lifetime that I began to understand through my sessions with Sarah, I was a woman named Kala, K-A-L-A, and I was the princess of Lemuria. And I grew up learning. I was trained to do all kinds of things, you know, your typical experience of a woman who is about to come into power at one point. And I had my grandmother, my mother, and everyone at the palace kind of instructing me to do this, to do that. And of course, you know, you're young, you want to go rogue, you want to do your own thing. And it was kind of a hard battle growing up in that area, from what I recalled in my sessions and I wrote about in the book, that it wasn't really something that I felt a natural calling towards. In fact, throughout my meditations as a child, we practiced with the red crystals meditating, we'd receive messages. We were kind of like sages in many ways to the people. We would try to get advice from otherworldly sources for them. We did have a source of connectivity that other people didn't have. And I wasn't happy doing it. I wanted to just be with someone. I wanted to have a life. I wanted to have children. I wanted to do all of these things that I couldn't do. And it was a real big source of constant drama between my mother and I, who was the queen and was the queen in every sense, shape, and form. She took it on beyond the duty of a queen, and it was hard to live up to her standards until one day visitors arrived from somewhere else that we were not familiar with, and they were untrustworthy from the beginning, and they wanted to know about the red crystals, that their civilization was being inundated with a virus and they needed the red crystals to activate some kind of immune technology, some health bringing technology that would save them. And then it gets a little complicated.
Yes. So why don't you just kind of like explain the level of technological development in Lemuria? Because I know people think of Lemuria as being kind of like technologically not so developed, but much more spiritually developed. So can you just give us a little bit of an insight of Lemurian society in terms of how they got things done and the level of technology? And of course, you mentioned the red crystals. So how was that part of the Lemurian society in general?
Yes, well, I think one of the most important roles the red crystals had in Lemurian society was creating this kind of immunity towards diseases that we had there. No one on the island would die from a disease. No one got sick. No one ever had anything like that. Now, we did have deaths. We did have injuries. And, you know, people would break bones, issues like that. But no one ever became ill and was sick. And that was something that the red crystals provided for us from like a very early time from the origination of the colony. So what I do recall from Lemuria, besides having the advanced immunity that the red crystals brought to the island, it wasn't specifically just the red crystals creating the immunity, but a technology that had been implanted early from when the colonization efforts were beginning, like from when the commander came down and worked, you know, in that lifetime. So we also had just a lot of, while we had beautiful buildings and things made out of stone, people were very happy to just have themselves and to have a spiritual connection to each other. They were much more highly spiritually advanced than the Atlanteans ever were. They weren't concerned with having like internet or, you know, glazed windows or anything like that. It was a very connected to the earth type of existence, and they pulled all of their everything you could ever want was there. The food, the happiness, the sunshine, the clean water. It was truly an existence of simplicity and beauty. So,
well, thank you for answering that. In the midst of that electronic interference, I mean, my computer just went dark. I mean, the power just went out. And so this is energetically, there's some very intense energies that are coming through this interview, and somehow that has set the electronics behaving in a very strange way.
I'm not surprised, because in our sessions that I did with Sarah Breskman Cosme, I've probably destroyed a couple of her laptops accidentally by having the same thing happen. We'd have electrical surges, we'd lose power. And another strange thing, during our sessions, a storm would always begin. We would always be beautiful when I would go into her office, and by the time I left, it was raining, pouring, the wind was pounding. It was just this whole wave of energy would come in and kind of encapsulate us when we would start doing our sessions. So for someone who came in as a skeptic, it kind of left me a little bit like I need to get insurance on all my electronics from now on.
Yeah, this is the intense energy that is through here. So have more of these interruptions. So let's go on. Now, in this Lemurian society, it was a matriarchy, and the queen would not actually take a husband or have a husband. When the time came for her to have a child, that some sort of artificial insemination process was used. So why don't you kind of explain what happened?
Definitely. Well, by the time the princess was old enough, it was usually around your 20th year, you were ready to conceive a child. They kind of timed your entire life out, which was something that also didn't work for me in that lifetime. But around the age of 20, you were taken into a specific room within the castle. Well, it was more of a palace. It was this kind of large structure I grew up in. And they would bring men from all over Lemuria. They would be nominated by their spiritual guidance elders. They would be nominated by whoever it was that thought that this would make an excellent kind of specimen to present to the queen, to be a potential, you know, donor for the queen, for her, the princess. So it was a bit of an awkward situation being inseminated in front of, you know, your mother, your grandmother, and then all these people. But that was kind of how the ceremony went. And it was an ancient tradition that we carried on, that they would produce the seed. I would have this ancient technology being, you know, inseminating the queen and the princess at the time. And hopefully 10 months later, you had a baby. And if you didn't, you were doing it again. So try to get it right the first time. But in that lifetime, I did. It worked the first time, and I gave birth to a beautiful, beautiful daughter that I loved more than anything else in the world. And it was a wonderful experience to experience childbirth in Lemuria.
So you have a child, and you're the princess, and you are destined to be the queen in a few years. So you're in your early 20s with a young girl, or I think what, she was 3 years old or something, when these visitors arrived. So yeah, who were the visitors? Where did they come from?
The visitors were the leaders or the hierarchy in Atlantis. They were people who were looking for a cure for a virus that had affected their society. And they had watched us for a very long time before they made themselves known to the Lemurians. They understood that we had a type of immunity that affected us on the island. And instead of well, they came to us at first very suddenly one night. In fact, I was standing on what I recall, and I wrote about in the book, is I stood on the balcony of where my room was in this palace. And in the distance along the water, I could see 5 glowing, it was like a green glowing circular object in the sky that they transported themselves in, these almost like glowing orbs that they brought themselves in. And from then on, it was about our working with them to understand how we could help them, how our 2 nations could work together. And we sat down one night with the others and we decided to get out the red crystals and to hold a session with them, one of our meditation sessions where we tapped in to whatever it was that we needed guidance on. And the guidance we received was a message from the commander saying, this is your unity is based on, these people are from the crew member who went to Atlantis, and your people are from the woman Evie who came from this original indigenous community with the commander. You are deeply tied together. Please try to make it work, but at the same time, do not give the Atlanteans any of the crystals. No matter what you do, just don't give them any of them. It's not meant for them. They need to figure this out on their own, that it's part of their evolutionary phasing and jumping, and that they have to do this without the crystals, because once they have the crystals, they will use them to hurt people. They will use them against people. And that's exactly what ended up happening. My mother gave them a crystal. Yeah. And it was the downfall of Lemuria.
Right. So the Atlanteans have these flying technologies, and they have knowledge of these ancient crystals that were used at the very beginning of the creation of Atlantean society. And so they see Lemuria as being a place where some of these crystals might be. Now, the Atlanteans are high tech, and they have some kind of virus that's rampant, that's going through their society, creating havoc. And yet Lemuria is low tech, and it's perfect health for everyone. So, the obvious question would be, well, didn't the Atlanteans just work out that their society was dysfunctional, and that somehow that was why that they were suffering this kind of virus, that they just hadn't reached some kind of moral or ethical balance with nature? I guess they just weren't aware of that. They were oblivious to that. And Lemuria was the opposite. You were in balance with nature and had perfect health. And rather than try and learn from you, the Atlanteans took a very different approach. So why don't you explain, what did the Atlanteans do?
Well, they asked us for all the crystals so that or some of the crystals so that they might go back and repower some of their ancient technology to try to reactivate this. They had lost their crystals over time. They had been taken away from them because they had abused them severely. And if you read the book, you'll learn a bit more about the animal people that are created to utilize the energy from these red crystals by the Atlanteans. It's very dark what they use the powers for. But instead of us handing over the rest of the crystals, my mother handed over a small one to the leader that they had there and said, this is what we can give you. We hope to have diplomatic relations with you. But this is all I'm willing to do at this point. And instead of saying thank you, they kind of left. And I believe they planted these bombs underneath the ocean, in certain rifts under the ocean, in order to create these seismic tidal waves that just kind of obliterated Lemuria. And I write about that in the book too. It was one of the things that kind of led me onto this lifetime, into understanding these lifetimes, is ever since I was a child, I've had a really strange dream, and it's something that recurs to me over the years. And in this dream, I am at the ocean, and it's kind of like a dark, dawn, right before dawn. And I look out at the ocean, and one moment it's calm, and the next moment I look and there's this towering wave every time in the dream standing before me. And every time in the dream, I turn around and I try to climb up the wall, this like limestone wall behind me that's at the beach. And I never make it to the top. And I wanted to understand what that dream was in my sessions with Sarah. So we began to do sessions trying to go into the dream a bit more and to see where it was coming from. And I think it's just what happened to me in that lifetime. This massive series of tidal waves came through, towering, and just wiped out everything in Lemuria, just wiping people off the planet. It was terrible. You know, you look at some of the situations you see in the tsunamis we've had in Japan and in Indonesia, and it was like that. It was just gone. But with the power of these bombs kind of pushing the waves beyond anything anyone has ever seen, we're talking like massive, unbelievable, just taking over the sky kind of waves.
Right, so the Atlanteans were very aggressive. They wouldn't take no for an answer. They wanted these crystals, and when your mother just gave them a small one and didn't hand over more than that, in an act of vengeance, or just maybe they were thinking that by wreaking havoc on Lemuria, that the survivors would be more amenable to handing over whatever crystals they knew about. So obviously that plan didn't work, but you, in the process, your mother gets killed, and you then coronated the new queen, but it's a very short reign, and these tidal waves happen from the detonations, and then you're captured. So you want to just maybe summarize that for people?
Definitely. I was captured. So in the lifetime, I was standing at the beach. I was summoned there by the fishermen. They're wondering where all the water is on the beach. So they wake me up at a really early hour, and my guards bring me down there, and we're trying to figure out like what these fishermen are going to do. Their boats are on the side. All the water's gone. There's fish flopping around and children trying to capture them. And then we all look up and we start seeing this thing coming in the distance. We can hear it coming, and it doesn't give anyone a chance. Everyone knows they're about to die as they look around. And I remember my daughter is in the palace. I have to get back to my daughter. And I turn, and I remember I started trying to climb up the wall. And as I'm climbing up this wall, and my fingers are bleeding, and I'm just like pulling at anything to get up there before the wave hits, just to be with her as it hits. I just felt myself being like pulled, sucked up by something. And suddenly I found myself in the middle of one of these glowing orbs that they had traveled there in. And they pulled me up, and they forced me to watch the wave crash down upon Lemuria. They forced me to watch it crash into the palace, to take my grandmother and to take my daughter. They forced me to watch it just drown hundreds of thousands of people. And it was one of the hardest sessions I ever had to do with Sarah, was to recount that kind of understanding. There was a lot of grief I felt just even saying it out loud in our sessions. It was very difficult. But what I realized when after I was in this floating orb and they had made me witness it, is that I was put to sleep in some kind of way, or my hysteria knocked me out, whatever it was. But when I awoke, I was a prisoner in Atlantis, and they were going to use me to get what they needed, no matter what.
So they clearly wanted the red crystals, and you refused to give them information about where they could find the red crystals, but they were also interested in your blood or your genetics, because they thought that there was something about it that would give them a secret in terms of health and how to survive this virus that was afflicting Atlantean society. So, what did they do to you?
Well, like a true scientifically advanced, society, they wanted to get to the very bottom of the powers of the usage of the crystals. And I was the perfect vessel to take in and to kind of do all this kind of experimentation with. The experimentation went on for years and years. And by in the course of the book, I talk about being a prisoner there for about 60 years. Everything was done, shock therapies, internal probing, all kinds of things that are just horrifically against the will of somebody. And they stopped at nothing to try to find out how to utilize the red crystal better. And when they realized after many generations that I wasn't speaking, that I was never going to give them the information, that they couldn't even extract it from me while I was meditating, they realized they were just going to have to go their own way and use the red crystal that my mother had given them in their own manner. And it was very unfortunate how they used it, though, because they used it for pure evil, just to use people to create energy. It was a really, it was the beginning of the end for Atlantis. It really was. They had hit a level where they were no longer being productive. They were just sucking the life out of everyone there for their, I guess you'd call it their 1%, their elite group, you know, their tops. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I noticed that they exploited these hybrid children, these chimera that had been created, and apparently many of these hybrid children had advanced psychic abilities, and they kind of used them to be able to access the whatever crystals that they had. And so, I mean, that kind of shows an imbalance in that Atlantean society, that they were technologically very advanced, kind of very left brain, scientific, empirical, but they understood that these advanced technologies existed, but you needed to have gifted psychics to be able to access those technologies. And so they exploited these hybrid children who had those abilities, which, you know, kind of has echoes with what's going on today. But, you know, we saw this happen in Atlantis and led to its destruction. So, yeah, anything more you want to say about these chimera that had been created by the Atlanteans?
Definitely. Well, Sarah Breskman-Cosnay asked me in a session, well, if you've come to me with all these past life memories, and some of my other clients have come to me with these past life memories of Atlantis, am I involved? Do I have a past life in Atlantis that I'm not aware of right now, or has been hidden from me for some reason? So when we asked about that in session, I began to tell her about the past life that I could see that she did have in Atlantis, where she was a judge, a very high-ranking judge in Atlantis. And her job was to decide what was going to happen to these animal children that were created as a byproduct of a vaccination event that happened because of the virus in Atlantis. And where everyone felt that these animal children that were created were just meant to be hidden away from society, that they needed to get rid of them, they needed to kill them, that they couldn't be seen or heard. You know, it was just a mar on the society's level of understanding of perfection of what they wanted, if you know what I'm saying, like that. So Sarah's job in that lifetime as the judge was to decide where the animal children would go, the animal people would go. They couldn't be just loaded up into an extermination camp on paper. So what they had created was an island that these children were sent off to, and they believed that the judges were told that the children were being put into like a rehabilitation place where they had everything they needed and they were being taken care of. But really, they were just obliterating them. They were using these type of rays that turn them into dust after extracting all this energy out of the children. They understood that the children could use the red crystals just like I could, and that it was a byproduct of this, the vaccine bringing this out in them. So for years and generations, they thought it was a terrible thing, that they needed to hide it. But truly, it was their saving grace. If they had actually embraced these animal children early on, they would have realized that they had the potential to cure everything they needed, that their problem was actually their solution, and they were just too blind to see it.
I remember reading the Edgar Cayce material, and he talked about these chimera in Atlantis, and that this was a real problem for the Atlanteans, how to deal with that. And he said that there was quite a significant proportion of the population that were hybrid or chimeras because they were experimenting, doing all these kinds of genetic things that just got out of control. But that makes perfect sense, what you said, that the Atlanteans just didn't understand that this phenomenon, the hybrid or the chimeras, actually were a solution in a way if they embraced it rather than control or exploit or exterminate.
That's really interesting. I actually not familiar with Edgar Cayce material. I've only, after doing all my sessions, have started to understand that other people have had this information as well. And when I hear about stuff like that, it makes my arms go all goosebumpy. I think it's interesting to see that, you know, these themes keep reappearing in our society, and maybe because we're not really paying attention to them, how we often don't learn from history and need to have it repeated in many ways. always something interesting to find out new or old versions of this that have already, kind of come into play in society.
Right. So you were there and actually played a role in the downfall of Atlantis, which I guess was a kind of karmic retribution for what they had done to Lemurian society. So what happened? What brought about Atlantis's downfall?
Well, I lived those 60 years in mostly isolation in their prisons, in what we would call their political prisons in Atlantis. While I was underground doing that, there was a lot of political turmoil happening amongst the Atlanteans themselves. They had issues with leadership. They had become just, things had gotten very convoluted and very complicated for them. And they were at a point where they were trying to free political prisoners when I was in my old age in one of my cells. And when this liberation came, I was liberated, but no one knew who I was. There were no records on me. I was just an older woman who no one could recognize except for one person, a young man who I had had an interaction with when he was a child, when I had tried to escape once. And that was the judge. And the judge recognized me from the political, from the liberation. And the judge took me in and decided to make me kind of, I don't know, just his ward. He wanted to understand me, why the experience he had with our interactions as a child happened. He felt that many things in his life had changed as a result of that. And so we spent time together over the course of about a year trying to understand each other a little bit in our older ages, just getting to the root of it all. And through the course of that, I understood that I needed to give this power to someone, but I didn't know who it was supposed to be. Like, who in Atlantis would you give that kind of power to, that I needed to transfer something? I kept getting these visions of my mother and my grandmother telling me that I need to hold on, that I need to pass this power on to someone, that she's coming, that I need to just hold it off and wait for it, that it can't die with me. So with that understanding, the judge introduced me to a young woman who was one of the granddaughters of another high-ranking judge. And she was a very special young woman because she had the attributes of the animal people. She had hidden very well for many, many years in order to not be sent to the island. And her and I worked together to transfer a lot of the memories of the people of Lemuria. I transferred the memory of the wave to her, of our people, the way we did things. And we were able to get her out of Atlantis before I used the energy along with the other animal children to blow the place up. So she was thrown into the vortex, like a chasm is what we call it in there. That was the name that I had for the vortex that transports people that I was given in the sessions. It was a chasm. And she's sent away and goes to another land to lead these people. And we kind of just, boom goes Atlantis. It was an energetic mishap, but it happened for a reason. And I think it was necessary because where they were heading was not a good place.
Right. So the destruction of Atlantis happened not long after the destruction of Lemuria, which was caused by the Atlantean aggression.
I'd say a good 60 years in between the two downfalls of the civilizations is what I understood.
And of course, both colonies were derived from these extraterrestrials that began genetic experiments, I guess centuries or even thousands of years earlier, that led to these two different civilizations that actually had a lot in common, but yet there was a lot of, well, I guess on the part of the Atlanteans, I mean, they just wanted to control. And on the part of the Lemurians, I guess they didn't have much interest in what was happening outside of their paradise, that kind of island continent.
Yeah, no, it was very focused. You know, the Lemurians were voyagers as well. I remember, and I write about in the books, that my mother was always going off on big business trips. She was sailing off to different lands that were colonies of ours that didn't have the same immunity and protections, but they took on our culture and they took on our practices, and we were all part of a big system of trade within the Pacific Ocean. And that the Atlanteans, of course, were over on their side, over in the Atlantic Ocean, on their rock, and while we may have had interactions between the two here and there was never anything quite formal up until the time that the others met with my mother and my grandmother and I in Lemúria. It was our first big moment. So,
I mean, this is truly a fascinating story, and you know, there's a lot worth. I recommend people, you know, to get the book, to read this. I guess available on Amazon, Child of the Universe. Now, in terms of today, what do you think the lessons are that people can get from this kind of unfortunate interaction between Atlantis and Lemúria that happened prior to the Great Flood many millennia ago?
well, I think for every individual, we all have our individual ways that we relate to this and our individual lessons that we're going to pull from it, because we're all so varied and have specific needs and wants and whatnot. But the most important thing that I took from all of this truly was looking at my life, this current life that I have, in a completely different way. It truly transformed the way I lived my life. It allowed me to open up different doors for myself within this realization. It allowed me to leave my home in the Florida Keys where I wasn't very happy. And it opened up the possibility of me moving to a new place with my family, to an island we found where we feel so at home and we feel so at peace. And it's truly allowed for me to go through my relationships with people and see them as not just people in this lifetime that cause issues for me, but maybe things from a past time that we needed to work out a little bit differently. So of everything that I've taken in, that I've understood, it's that the world kind of looks like it's falling down all around us right now, but the most important thing is to kind of turn inwards and find your inner power, find who you truly are, and get to a good place and a good understanding with who you are, because that's the key to everything moving forward. You could have aliens land on your front lawn tomorrow, and you know, what is it? What's the depth there for you? What can you take from it and put into your own life? And I think that's something a lot of people are looking for right now, is just what's the bigger message in all of this that's happening to us around the world. And I think it's for us to look introspectively and see what we're denying ourselves, see what kind of reality that we could have if we were truly being ourselves and not living up to these conformities that society has kind of laid out for us our whole lives.
Very well said. I guess one of the big takeaways from the history of Atlantis is that it was abusing technology, high tech, and that ultimately played a great role in its downfall. Now, we, in our current situation on the planet Earth, have a lot of advanced technology that's being used, and it's being abused again. Now, do you think, or do you know from any kind of experiences or communications you've had, whether we are going to implode or whether we're going to enter a golden age?
I think there's always hope. There's always something that you need to hold on to, because if you don't have that, then what are you existing for? I think you take a very different turn in your perspective of life if you're looking at the earth as something that's going to implode. If it implodes, I guarantee you, we're only going to have about 10 seconds left to kind of figure it all out. You know, it's not going to be something you can maneuver out of. So it's better to take on the feeling that we are going to be successful in turning this around, that my children are going to be able to grow up in a world where their grandchildren are going to get everything they need and have access to the healthcare, the educational systems, and the nutrition that they require in order to become, you know, constructive human beings. And I hope for their sake that this is exactly where we're heading, into a new, this is just us peeling off a really nasty scab that we need to get rid of, or getting rid of that outer layer of the snake skin that we needed to shed so badly.
I just want to mention that your book, Child of the Universe, that just came out, I think you mentioned about a month before a book by Sarah Bressman-Cosme that dealt with your sessions and also sessions of others that were very, very similar, talking about Atlantis and Lemúria, that they came out a month apart. And I thought this book is fascinating, but for those that are saying, well, is there any evidence supporting this? I mean, we spoke about your tumor, but I think the fact is that Sarah interviewed others or did these regressions, these QHHT regressions on others who had very similar stories to you that kind of matched. I mean, that I thought was very good, very important. So this book and Sarah's book are kind of in a way companions. So do you want to say anything about your book and Sarah's book, how both came into fruition?
Definitely. We decided to start writing them around the same time. Sarah's book details all the sessions that Sarah and I had, word for word, pretty much everything that came out of her mouth and everything that came out of my mouth during the sessions. And also the sessions of other people who started to come to her after our sessions began, not knowing what she was talking to me about, not knowing anything else about Atlantis or any of her other clients. And they started describing the same place to her and describing the same jumpsuits that we wore as the commander and all these different kinds of similarities that she just found it all to be too uncanny to not put it down on paper. And so we worked together and we created her book and I wrote my book as well, which is more of a first person perspective of the experience of living through that lifetime. So it's a bit more of a story. Mine, you can sit down and you could write it, you could read it, and it's kind of like watching a little mini series. And then you've got Sarah's book and it gives you all the backup information of other things that happened to other people. Plus, on top of that, I have received so many emails and letters from different people who've read my book who tell me the same thing, like, I've been dreaming of the wave my entire life, or I've had this experience, or I remember Atlantis that way, or I remember being an animal child. And they write me these long letters and emails telling me all about the experience and how it affects their lives now and what they've decided, not what they've decided, but what they've begun to understand about themselves that's allowing them to move on from that traumatic experience in a past life. And it really is just about being able to relate to other people and being able to see what that experience was and bring it to light. It's just the same as any kind of trauma you would experience in your lifetime. Talking about it helps. And I think the same thing helps for past life trauma in some ways, You all can find a way to relate, to combine what you've understood, and in a way you get to a place of inner peace from it. You put it to sleep.
So where can people get your book? And if they want to get in touch with you, I mean, do you have a website that they can go to?
Definitely. I'll give you the information for myself and also for Sarah Breskman-Cosme too. Two great sources of information here. So my book is available on Amazon. You can just type in Child of the Universe, JLF Sullivan. You could find it right there. Or you could go to my website, which is jlfsullivan.com. And I have links right there on the first page. You can read up more on the books. I'm actually working on a second book that's kind of a follow-up to this one, a little bit more about the other past lives. They're all connected in the most amazing way, like this big puzzle. So I feel like I could write about this for years and tell you about so many other past lives. And it actually tells you a much bigger story about our colonization efforts here on Earth. And for Sarah, she has a great website. It's called theholistichuhypnotist.com. And you can book sessions to do QHHT hypnosis sessions with her through there. And you can contact both of us through our websites. We're both on Facebook and Instagram. So you could find us on all that good stuff through our websites and kind of see what we're up to.
Well, I think this is an age of remembering, and you've done a great job in bringing forward your memories, and that will help the collective consciousness of humanity to remember, because I know those that are in control of our planet and the information and the finances, and they are very intent on suppressing these memories. So we really need people like you, people like Sarah, to come forward sharing this information. And by the way, I did read a lot of the information from Dolores Cannon, the convoluted universe, and I think that information is also very complementary to everything you've said, and it does describe how people are having these recollections of these prior lives, and this is a very important thing. And I think that really helps us to listen to the stories of those that have remembered, because all of us that are interested in these kind of stories likely have our own experiences that we need to remember. And as more of us remember, it'll be easier and easier for the whole planet to have this kind of like moment of remembrance.
Very much so. It feels like that's truly what it leads to, that there are parts of you that need to remember in order to move on with our lives here, in order to move past whatever constraints we found ourselves in this lifetime that may echo ones from previous. And you know, how do you get past that? You have to confront it. You need to bring it out. You need to write it down. You need to share it with other people. And you don't need to feel like you have to conform into some image of something in society that, you know, is this perfection. You need to just be yourself and be comfortable in that.
Well, thank you, Jen, for being on Exopolitics today. I look forward to your second book coming out, and I definitely would love to have you back on the show.
Wonderful. I'll send you one out just as soon as it's fresh off the press. You got it.
Fantastic.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.